It was Christmas Eve and Alejandro Ruiz was walking through the snowy streets of downtown Madrid when he saw something that stopped his heart. On a bench in front of his office building, with 2 bags of clothing at her feet and a child in her arms, was Julia Martinez, his employee. The woman who arrived punctual, smiling, impeccable every morning. She was there in the cold with her 4-year-old son who was shivering despite his little orange jacket. Alejandro approached, unable to believe his eyes. And when the little boy saw him, he raised his tiny hand with his teddy bear and said something that shattered Alejandro's heart into 1,000 pieces. He asked if Alejandro could tell Santa Claus that they had moved, because they wouldn't be home that night and he was scared the presents wouldn't come. Alejandro looked at Julia, who dropped her eyes, full of shame, and he understood that this woman he saw every day at the office was hiding a secret that was about to change everything. Are you ready for this story? Tell me in the comments where you're watching this video from. Julia Martinez was 32 and had worked as a secretary at Ruiz Construcciones for 5 years. She was one of those employees every company dreams of having. Punctual, efficient, always available. She arrived every morning at 8, half an hour before work started, and often stayed late to finish urgent documents. She never complained, never asked for raises, never caused problems. In the office, she was known as the one who could fix anything. When there was a crisis, they called Julia. When a client was angry, they put the call through to Julia. When something went wrong, she was always the one who fixed it. Her colleagues respected her, some envied her. No one really knew who she was. Alejandro Ruiz, the company's CEO, knew her as the woman who made his coffee every morning, who organized his appointments, who answered calls with that professional and kind voice that put even the most difficult clients at ease. He knew she was a single mother because he'd once overheard her on the phone with her son's daycare. He knew she lived somewhere in the suburbs because he'd heard her tell a coworker she took 2 buses to get to work, but he knew nothing more because Julia was very good at hiding. She hid that her ex-partner, Marcos, had left her when he found out she was pregnant. He had told her he wasn't ready to be a father, that he had other plans, that she should understand. He had disappeared within a week, taking his clothes and leaving her with an empty apartment and a broken heart. She hid that her parents had died in an accident when she was 20, leaving her alone in the world with an unfinished degree and no financial support. She hid that her older sister had moved to Argentina and they hadn't spoken in years, after a silly fight neither of them had had the courage to resolve. She hid that she had no one, absolutely no one to trust. And above all, she hid that for the past 3 months she had been living in an impossible situation. It had all started in September when the landlord of the apartment she was renting decided to sell the property. Julia had looked for a new place, but rental prices in Madrid had skyrocketed and on her secretary's salary she couldn't afford anything decent. She found a room in a shared apartment, but the landlord didn't accept children. She tried public housing, but the waiting list was years long. In the end, she had found a temporary solution. A coworker had lent her an empty studio, telling her she could stay there while she found something better. Julia had accepted gratefully, thinking it would be a matter of weeks, but the weeks had turned into months and the coworker had decided to sell, too. Julia had to leave on December 23rd, the day before Christmas Eve. She hadn't found anything else. She didn't have money for a hotel. She had no one to call. And so she had ended up on that bench with her son Mateo in her arms and 2 bags containing everything they owned, trying to figure out what to do while the December cold froze her bones. Alejandro Ruiz was 38, had wealth he couldn't even count, and a life that from the outside looked perfect. He was the CEO of a construction company he had inherited from his father. He owned a penthouse in downtown Madrid overlooking the Retiro Park. He drove the latest model Mercedes and frequented the city's most exclusive restaurants. Business magazines interviewed him regularly, competitors feared him, employees respected him. He was the image of Spanish success, the businessman who had taken a solid company and turned it into an empire. Under his leadership, Ruiz Construcciones had doubled its revenue, expanding throughout Spain and even abroad. But Alejandro was alone. deeply, irreparably alone. He had married at 30 to a woman he had loved with all his being. Elena. He'd met her at a business dinner. She was a lawyer at a prestigious Barcelona firm. They had liked each other immediately. They started dating, and after a year he had proposed to her in a villa in Mallorca. They had planned a life together, children, a house in the mountains, vacations on the coast. Elena had moved to Madrid for him. She had left her career in Barcelona. She had sacrificed everything to be with the man she loved. But after 2 years of marriage, Elena left. There was no other man, no infidelity. She simply said she wasn't happy, that he worked too much, that there was no room in his life for her. Alejandro had never recovered. He had built walls around his heart. He had thrown himself into work. He had stopped looking for love. At 38, he was a successful man who returned every night to an empty apartment. He ate dinner alone, watched TV alone, slept alone. This Christmas Eve, he was returning to the office to pick up some forgotten documents. He had no plans for the night, no family dinner, no friend to celebrate with. His parents had died years before. He had no siblings, and the relatives he had left all lived in Andalusia, and he hadn't seen them in years. He would spend Christmas as he always did, alone with a bottle of wine and a movie on TV. But then he saw Julia. When he approached the bench, he couldn't believe his eyes. His secretary, that woman always impeccable and smiling, was sitting in the cold with a small child, surrounded by bags of clothes, with the look of someone who had lost all hope. And then the child spoke. Mateo was 4 years old and didn't understand what was happening. He only knew that Mom was crying, that it was cold, and that they wouldn't be home that night. And his biggest concern, in his childlike innocence, was that Santa Claus wouldn't find them. When he saw this elegant man approaching, he thought maybe he could help them. Grown-ups always knew everything, right? Maybe this man knew how to contact Santa and tell him where to find them. Alejandro heard that innocent question and something inside him broke. He looked at Julia, who kept her eyes down, her face red with shame, tears silently falling down her cheeks, and he understood that this woman he saw every day, who smiled at him every morning, who seemed to have it all under control, was living through a hell he knew nothing about. Julia wanted to disappear. She wanted the ground to open up and swallow her, for this scene not to be happening, for her boss not to be seeing her like this. For 5 years she had maintained a facade of professionalism, dignity, normalcy, and now it had all collapsed in an instant. She tried to get up, say something, invent an excuse. She said they were waiting for a friend, that everything was fine, that he shouldn't worry, but her voice trembled. And Mateo, with the innocence of children, immediately contradicted her, saying the friend wasn't coming and that Mom had said they would sleep outside. Alejandro was silent for a moment, processing what he was hearing. His secretary was homeless, on Christmas Eve, with a 4-year-old child, and he hadn't known. Julia started to talk, the words spilling out as if she couldn't stop them. She told him about the borrowed studio, the sale, the desperate search for a new apartment. She told him she had no one, that she had tried everything, that she no longer knew what to do. And then she stopped, realizing she was saying too much, showing too much, humiliating herself in front of her boss. She apologized. She said she would find a solution, that she didn't want to bother him, that she could go, that she would be at the office on Monday as always, punctual and professional. But Alejandro didn't move. He told her he couldn't leave her there. He said it was going to be 23 degrees Fahrenheit that night and that a child couldn't sleep in the cold. He said he had a big house, too big for one person, and that he had empty rooms he never used. He said it wasn't charity, it was simply the right thing to do. Julia refused immediately. She said she couldn't accept, that it wasn't appropriate, that he was her boss and she was his employee. She said she would find a shelter, a church, something. She said she didn't want his charity. But Mateo was shivering. His little nose was red from the cold. His little hands clutched the teddy bear as if it were the only safe thing in a world he didn't understand. And Julia, looking at her son, understood that her pride could not be worth more than her child's well-being. She accepted. With tears in her eyes and shame in her heart, she accepted. Alejandro's penthouse was exactly as Julia had imagined it, and at the same time completely different. It was huge, elegant, with designer furniture and paintings on the walls that probably cost more than her annual salary. The floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the lit-up city, and you could see the Sibyl's palace shining in the night like a beacon. But it was also cold, impersonal, empty. There were no family photos, no personal objects, nothing that told the story of who lived there. The books on the shelves seemed never opened, the sofa cushions seemed never used. It was a design magazine house, beautiful to look at, but impossible to live in. Alejandro showed her the guest room, a spacious room with a queen-sized bed and a private bathroom. There were clean towels on the bed, new soap in the bathroom, everything perfect and prepared, like a luxury hotel. He told her she could stay as long as she wanted, that there was no rush, that they would think about the rest after the holidays. Julia nodded, too tired and too grateful to argue. Mateo, however, was delighted. To him, this house was a castle with huge rooms to explore and windows looking out at the city lights. He ran from one side to the other, forgetting for a moment the cold and the fear, being simply a curious child in a new place. He jumped on the leather sofa, climbed onto the chairs, looked out the window with wide eyes at the lights, and then he remembered Santa. He asked Alejandro if now he could tell Santa where to find them. He said he was worried because they didn't have a tree and they hadn't left out cookies. He asked if Santa would be angry. Alejandro knelt in front of him and told him that Santa always knew where to find good children. He told him not to worry, that the presents would come. Mateo smiled, reassured, and ran off to explore more. Julia watched this scene with a heavy heart. She knew there wasn't a single present for Mateo in her bag. She had spent her last money on food. She hadn't been able to afford anything for Christmas. Her son would wake up the next morning with nothing under the non-existent tree. Alejandro noticed her expression and understood. He didn't say anything, but when Julia went to put Mateo to bed, he went out. Are you enjoying this story? Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now let's continue with the video. He returned an hour later with bags full of packages, toys, clothes, candy, everything a 4-year-old boy could want. Julia saw him from the bedroom door and couldn't hold back the tears. She told him she couldn't accept it, that it was too much, that she would find a way to pay him back for everything. But Alejandro shook his head. He told her they weren't gifts for her, they were gifts for Mateo, that every child deserved a happy Christmas, and that he didn't want anything in return. That night, while Mateo slept in the big bed in the guest room, Julia and Alejandro sat in the living room with 2 glasses of wine and for the first time began to talk for real. Julia told him her story. Her dead parents, the vanished ex, the years of struggle to get by. She told him how every day was a battle to maintain her dignity, not to break down, to give Mateo a normal life despite everything. And Alejandro, surprising even himself, told her his. The failed marriage, the loneliness, the nights spent in that empty apartment, wondering if there was anything more to life besides work. He told her that this huge house was a golden prison, that all the money in the world couldn't buy what he didn't have, someone to share his life with. They talked late into the night, much later than was appropriate between a boss and an employee. But somehow, that night, they had stopped being boss and employee. They were just 2 lonely people who had found someone to talk to. Mateo woke up at 6 in the morning, as all children do on Christmas morning. It was still dark outside, but he couldn't sleep any longer. He got out of the big bed where he had slept with Mom and tiptoed out of the room. He ran to the living room and found something that took his breath away. In the living room was a tree. A real tree, huge, covered in lights and decorations. It looked like something out of a movie, with colored balls, golden garlands, and a shining star on top that almost touched the ceiling. And under the tree were packages. So many packages, all for him, with red and green bows and shiny paper. The little boy started jumping up and down, shouting that Santa had found them, that the nice man had told him the truth. His voice echoed through the apartment, waking everyone up. Julia woke up with a start and ran to the living room, finding her son tearing open wrapping paper with an excitement she hadn't seen in months. There were toys everywhere, an electric train, a remote-control car, puzzles, picture books, stuffed animals, everything a 4-year-old could want. Alejandro was already awake, sitting on the sofa with a cup of coffee in his hand, watching this scene with a smile he hadn't worn on his face in years. He was still in his pajamas, his hair messy, looking like someone who hadn't slept much. He had spent the night setting up that tree, placing those gifts, creating something he had never had, a real family Christmas. Julia sat down next to him, her eyes shining, unable to find the words. She said thank you, but the words seemed insufficient to express what she felt. Alejandro told her she didn't have to thank him, that he was the one who should thank her, because that morning, for the first time in years, he hadn't woken up alone. Mateo ran over to them with a little train in his hands, his favorite among all the gifts he'd opened. He asked Alejandro if he could play with it. And the man everyone considered cold and distant found himself sitting on the floor making toy trains go along imaginary tracks, laughing like a child. Julia watched them and something in her heart began to change. It wasn't gratitude, it was something different. It was the feeling of being in the right place, with the right people, for the first time in a very long time. In the afternoon, Alejandro suggested they go out. He said there was a restaurant that did an exceptional Christmas lunch and that Mateo would love the dessert. Julia hesitated, but Mateo had already run to get his jacket and she didn't have the heart to say no. The lunch was long and full of laughter. Mateo chattered about everything that came into his head. Alejandro listened with a genuine interest that surprised even himself. And Julia found herself smiling more than she had smiled in months. The waiters looked at them thinking they were a family, and none of the three corrected them. When they got home, Mateo was exhausted. He fell asleep on the sofa watching cartoons with his head on Alejandro's lap and his feet on Julia's. The two adults looked at each other over the sleeping child and something passed between them. They didn't need words to understand that this day had changed something for all three of them. The holidays passed, but Julia and Mateo didn't return to that bench. Alejandro had insisted they stay until they found a suitable apartment, and that search seemed strangely unhurried. At first, there was awkwardness. Julia felt like a guest. She tiptoed around. She tried to take up as little space as possible. She apologized for everything, for the noise Mateo made, for the dishes she used, for the hot water she used. Alejandro had to keep telling her it was her home, that she could do whatever she wanted, that she didn't need to ask permission to open the refrigerator. The weeks turned into months and the dynamic in that house gradually changed. Julia started making dinner for the three of them, discovering that Alejandro hadn't had a home-cooked meal in years. Alejandro started coming home from work earlier and earlier to play with Mateo, discovering that was his favorite part of the day. Mateo started calling Alejandro by his first name instead of Señor, and then he started going to him when he needed something, as if it were natural. At the office, they kept up appearances. Julia was still the professional secretary. Alejandro was still the respected CEO. No one knew they lived together. No one needed to know. But coworkers noticed something different. She smiled more. He seemed less stressed. There was a light in their eyes that hadn't been there before. The veteran secretary, the one who had worked there for 20 years and saw everything, understood. But she didn't say anything. She just smiled whenever she saw them together, as if she knew a secret they weren't yet brave enough to admit. 6 months passed before someone made the first move. It was Alejandro. One night in June, as they sat on the terrace watching the sunset over the city, with Mateo in bed and the house quiet, he finally found the courage to say what he had been feeling for a long time. He told her he didn't want her to leave. He said that this house, which for years had been a prison, had become a place he wanted to come home to. He told her Mateo had become important to him, more important than he had ever imagined a child who wasn't his could be. And then he told her that she had become the most important person in his life. Julia listened with her heart pounding. For months she had fought against what she felt, telling herself it was gratitude, that it was convenience, that it couldn't be love. But she knew she was lying to herself. She knew that when she saw him playing with her son, when she heard him laugh, when she saw him fall asleep on the sofa with Mateo in his arms, she felt something she had never felt, not even with Marcos, her son's father. She didn't answer with words. She simply kissed him under that sky turning pink and orange, and in that kiss was everything they hadn't been able to say to each other for months. 1 year after that Christmas Eve, they got married. It was a small ceremony, just the three of them and a few friends, at Madrid City Hall with the snowy mountains in the background. Julia wore a simple ivory dress that Alejandro had given her. Mateo wore a little blue suit that made him look like a tiny businessman. He carried the rings on a velvet pillow, proud of his important role. And when the judge declared them husband and wife, he shouted that finally Alejandro was his real dad. Everyone present laughed and cried at the same time. Alejandro picked him up and told him he had always been his dad from the moment he had asked him to tell Santa where to find them, that innocent question asked by a cold little boy on a bench had changed everything. It had saved not only Mateo and Julia, but him, too. It had given meaning to a life that seemed empty. It had filled a house that had always been silent. 2 years later, Mateo had a little sister. They named her Aurora, because she was born at dawn on a spring day, and because she represented the new beginning the three of them had found together. Julia was no longer Alejandro's secretary. She had left work to be with the children, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She knew she could go back whenever she wanted, that Alejandro would always support her in anything she decided to do, but for now she just wanted to enjoy this life she had never thought she'd have. Alejandro had sold the penthouse and they had bought a house in the mountains with a garden where Mateo could run and a porch where they could sit and watch the sunsets. It was a real house, not a design showpiece, with children's handprints on the walls and toys scattered everywhere. The neighbors greeted them when they went out in the morning. The kids from the neighborhood came to play with Mateo in the garden. The house was always full of laughter and life. It was everything Alejandro had always dreamed of without knowing it, everything Julia had always wished for without daring to hope. The company was still running perfectly, but now Alejandro delegated more, trusted his team more, allowed himself vacations that would have seemed impossible before. He had discovered that professional success, without someone to share it with, was worth nothing. Every Christmas Eve they told Mateo the story of how they met. About that bench, those bags, that question that changed everything. Mateo was old enough to understand now, but he still loved hearing the story. He loved knowing that his father wasn't the one who had abandoned him before he was born, but the one who had stopped on a cold night and decided to stay. And whenever a child asked him if Santa was real, Mateo answered that yes, he was real, but that sometimes he didn't wear a red suit and arrive in a sleigh. Sometimes he wore an elegant suit and arrived walking down the street just when you needed him most. The most recent Christmas Eve, the one before Aurora turned 1, Mateo asked his mother a question. He asked if she remembered that night on the bench, if she had been scared. Julia hugged him and said yes, she had been scared. Very scared. But that fear had been the price to pay to get to where they were now, because sometimes life takes everything away from you so it can give you something better. Sometimes it makes you hit rock bottom so you discover that someone is willing to lift you up. Sometimes the darkest moments are just the doorway to the most beautiful light. That Christmas Eve, sitting around the tree with Aurora sleeping in her crib and Mateo opening presents, Julia and Alejandro looked at each other with the same look from that night 3 years before. But now there was no shame, no fear, only love, gratitude, and the certainty that everything they had been through had been worth it. Because every story has a beginning, and theirs had started with an innocent question from a child with a teddy bear in his hand, a question about Santa Claus that had found the most beautiful answer of all. If this story has reminded you that sometimes miracles arrive when you least expect them, and that families are built not just with blood, but with love, leave a little sign that you were here down below. A simple gesture that means a lot to the person who creates these stories from the heart. And if you've stayed until the end, if you chose to accompany Julia, Alejandro, and Mateo on this journey from despair to happiness, then this story now lives in you, too. Because the most beautiful stories are often born in the most unexpected moments, sometimes on a cold bench on Christmas Eve, when a child asks a stranger to talk to Santa.